Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the Wisdom of Rich Diviney. We live in, as I keep saying, an increasingly complex world, socially, politically, economically, commercially, and with the complexity that surrounds us today, we're in greater need than ever before for these purveyors of deeper thinking, these purveyors of greater wisdom, the people that take pause when confronted with a challenge and think their way through it rather than looking for what's the quick tip, trick, hack that I can use to get a quick win with no sense of the consequence for the long-term outcomes. These thinkers that we're interviewing for the Wisdom of Show are part of a renaissance of wisdom. I really think there is this desire amongst these types of people to bring the world back to a deeper level of thinking, a better level of leadership, and a greater sense of stewardship. And Rich and I have spent time on Zoom talking about some of the things that he focuses on, and it's going to be a fascinating episode. I'm really looking forward to this. And so welcome to the episode, Rich.
Oh, thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here. And as usual, I love our conversations. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Well, you come from an interesting background, to say the least, and you come from an environment that I'm guessing, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I'm going to say 99.99% of the population never get near, which is the Navy SEALs, right? So people that are expected to perform at the highest possible level in a complex set of circumstances with, complex equipment and strategy in harsh, often hostile operating environments where there's little room for error. This is a level of performance that that most people are never challenged with, and indeed, you were charged with the responsibility of finding the right people to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
Navy SEALs, and then being a part of the process of getting them prepared for operational duties. And since that time, you've worked with Simon Sinek. You started Chapman Co Leadership, or you work with Chapman Co Leadership Institute, and you are a high performance consultant, published author, best-selling author, speaker, consultant, working in the realm of peak human performance. And I love this line: Navy SEAL expertise meets performance science. That probably says everything that we need to understand. And honestly, when people are thinking about leadership and how do we drive and strive for higher levels of performance inside our teams, there's a lot to be learnt
hmm
from the sorts of things that you've had to deal with. So, I want to do this in a couple of parts. You have a real focus on attributes, which is an interesting word. And as we get through the latter part of the episode, I'd love to talk a bit about attributes, because I think that'll give people some real more granular things to think
hmm
about. But this environment that military generally find themselves in, and I've spoken to a lot of and worked with a lot of military officers, is a high accountability environment.
Yeah.
And I am often impressed at just how much senior military leaders actually seem to care about everything.
Yeah.
They seem to actually care. They care about the environment. They care about uh, unfair treatment of people. They care about inequalities. They're much more complex people than we think, and I view a lot of them as actually having a real level of stewardship
Yeah.
about what they do. They're stewards of often a better world, right? And so let me go straight for the heavy stuff. When you balance up this notion of stewardship and leadership, because leadership's almost a throwaway term these days, what comes into your mind when you think about this responsibility to be a steward of something versus this responsibility to be a leader of something?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. It's a very deep question, obviously, as you
Mm.
know, and the audience would imagine. So I think part of the start point for us would be to help define some terms. And
Yes.
so I think one of the things that certainly military leaders, or at least leaders in my previous profession, special operations, did, was we looked at at performance a very specific way, and we looked at leadership a very specific way. And so let me start with performance. And the idea is that we look at performance in a much more holistic manner than most people. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just take this concept of peak performance. There's a lot of talk. There has been always a lot of talk around peak performance, and everybody
Mm,
wants to strive and maintain and achieve peak performance. They want to peak here, peak there, and peak everywhere. And in fact, people used to tell me, "You Navy SEALs are the ultimate peak performers." But I always disagreed with that statement. And there's a reason. It's because peak, by definition, is an apex. And there's
mm,
only one place you can go from an apex, and that's downward, right? And the other thing about peak is that peak often has to be planned for and scheduled and prepared for. The professional football player plans and schedules
mm,
his or her entire week to peak for game day, right? We don't get to do that. Navy SEALs don't get to do that. Regular people don't get to do that, and whether you're in personal life or professional life. And I used to say we're not peak performers, we are optimal performers. Optimal performance is something a little bit different. Optimal performance means that I'm going to do the very best in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment. Okay. So sometimes our best in the moment could look like peak and everything's flowing and clicking and it's flow states and everything's cool and groovy. But sometimes our best in the moment could be I am just head down, gutting it out, going step by step because that's all I have right now. And that is
mm,
still performing optimally. And so optimal performance allows us two very important things. First of all, it allows us to celebrate those times when we are not at peak, okay? Because we can't be peak all the time. And I can't tell you how many missions, and I went on hundreds of combat missions overseas. I can't tell you how many missions we came back from and we'd be like, man, that was ugly. But we did the job. We did what we had to do. So it allows you to celebrate those times when you're not at peak. And then the second thing it allows you to, which is probably a little bit more important and kind of will segue into the leadership portion, is that it allows us to do what I call responsible energy management. In other words, I don't need to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. Okay, I can be at some other energy level. And
mm.
a myth I'll bust about Navy SEALs just right off the bat, because there's a lot of TV and movies about them, is you might see a group of SEALs on TV or movies, and they're getting ready to go on a mission, and right before they go, they're all huddling up and they're hoo-yawing and they're high-fiving like some sports team getting ready to take the field. Well, I'll tell you, that never happens, ever. In fact, most of the time we'd be in our helicopters flying into combat, and the guys around me would be asleep. They'd be napping. And there's a reason behind that. It's because we don't know what's coming. We don't know how long we're going to be out there. We don't know what's going to be required energetically. We're not going to waste an ounce of our energy doing things we don't need to do. And so optimal performance allows us to think of performance as this umbrella underneath which peak lives and gutting it out lives and even recovery lives. Right. So
Mm.
all of that goes into the performance picture. So that's the first thing. We have to really think about and define performance more holistically. And then that also seeds into how we start to look at leadership. But let me stop there because I know I knew I
Yeah,
threw a
well,
word.
I mean, there's a lot, and straight off the bat, right, a paradigm shift for people to think about. What an odd term, the ultimate peak performers.
Mhm.
Well, there can only be one at the peak, so
Yes,
ultimate's a redundant word. We
that's
use.
right.
I love that you wanted to get some definitions right first, because I think when we think about this concept of being a steward, and let's imagine that leaders in companies and government and military are stewards of
Yeah,
optimal performance. Let's
yeah,
think that you've been
yeah,
given assets to manage, and the quote unquote our people are our greatest asset, but you've been
yeah,
given
yeah.
these resources to manage.
Right.
Are you being a steward of those resources? And so let's get some definitions right, because language is used in such a throwaway way.
Yeah, that's true.
But
That's
but
true.
language is what defines us.
Hmm.
Humans are the only species that have to be able to put a word on something to hold on to the concept.
Yeah, and
You know,
it's in the proper articulation of language that we provide clarity, and with clarity we can actually repeat, we can train, repeat result, and train and repeat results because we
yes,
know exactly what's going on. So let's just talk about stewardship because we have to get clear on some other terms before we get into stewardship. The other term is what is a high performing team?
yeah,
Okay, and high performing team is any group of two or more people working together towards a common goal or objective that perform not only when things are going well, but also when things are not going well. And that's the key distinguishing factor between a regular
yeah,
team and a high performing team. The high performing team, any team can perform when everything's going great. The high performing teams perform when things are going bad. The plan doesn't go as predicted, and what hits the fan. The idea is that high performing teams can exist anywhere. They can exist obviously on the military, on the battlefield, on the sports field, even in the business profession. But it can also be a great marriage. A high performing team can be a group of friends on a trip working together, a group of people working together on a project for a community. All this to say is a high performing team is that. And then the other thing we have to kind of get clear on is, what does a high performing team look like? And this is where we get into stewardship. And this question was actually posed to me when I first got out of the Navy. A group of executives I was talking to, I had a flip chart next to me, and they said, Rich, could you draw for us what you believe the best task organization shape is for a high performing team? Okay. And honestly, I was a little bit stumped because the models I had in my head weren't really cutting it. I obviously had the pyramid that we've all seen. The leader sits on top and word flows down. And then it has to flow all the way up. That's obviously it's too bureaucratic, too slow, it just doesn't work for a high performing team. So I wasn't going to use that one. I had the flat line, which is the flat model, which is a mild rebellion to the pyramid. They said, hey, let's flatten this thing. No one outranks anybody. We're all in this together. It's all groovy. It's all cool. That's not too bad, other than in a flat model, you sometimes have difficulty figuring out who's in charge. And you also, something can happen on the right side of that line that's not seen or heard by the left side, right? So in other words, information can get siloed pretty quickly in a flat model. And that never happens in a high performing team. Information is abundant and everywhere. Then finally, I had the Robert Greenleaf servant leadership model, where he took that pyramid, he flipped it upside down, said the leader sits on the bottom and the leader is in service to everybody in his or her span of care. And honestly, if I were to pick one of the three, philosophically, I'd pick that one. That's probably the most beautiful. However, that's still not how a high-performing team operates, because in a high-performing team, burden is distributed. It's not all on one person. And so really largely in frustration, I drew on the board a blob, an amoeba, and I said, where do you think the leader sits in this blob? And I got answers like, front, back, top, bottom, center. And I said, all of you are correct. In this amoeba or blob, the leader is wherever the leader needs to be in the moment. And this is a concept that we call dynamic subordination. And dynamic subordination implies that a team understands that problems and challenges and issues can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to that problem, the most competent, immediately steps up and takes lead, and everybody follows, right? And then something else happens, someone else steps up. It's a dynamic swap between leader and follower. I also call it alpha hopping. The alpha position hops to wherever it needs to be. And so what this means is that our position on a team has nothing to do with rank. It has everything to do with what we are there to contribute to the team. And, I was an officer in the Navy. I was in charge of every single mission I went on. I went on hundreds. It didn't mean I was always being supported. In fact, it obviously often meant the opposite. I was supporting others, my breachers, my snipers. But what this means is that my job as the person in charge, or the leader, becomes about managing the environment, not necessarily the people. I need to create an environment where the team and the people understand that they are empowered to step up and step back when needed. And so I think a lot of people or organizations get this wrong. They think the leader needs to sit at top and direct down. And honestly, the leader needs to and really even manage people. But it's really not about managing people. It's about managing the environment. If you manage the environment takes care of the way the people begin to behave, and you empower the people to behave in the leadership or the follower role.
So much to unpack. As you know, we use really deliberately designed visual models to help people to express genius and value, and how what the company does and what it takes to the market. And you're rarely do I meet somebody who thinks about models in a productive way. And your walkthrough then of, I thought through a bunch of models and they didn't work. The flat line didn't work because the left doesn't know what's happening on the right, but then who does take charge when you need to? The typical pyramid doesn't work. And it's fascinating that the executive asked you, what is the shape of a high performing team? And actually, there's a subconscious thought process that goes on in a lot of people's heads. What is the shape of that? What does that look like? And geometry is pretty magical, actually. And as soon as you go to a blob, you go and you say, where is the leader in that blob? And another answer might have been, well, they are distributed through the blob, because multiple people will sit next to the leadership role at multiple points in time. So, listening to you talk through that, as a series of models is fascinating. And then you talked about the environment, because the environment always wins.
Hmm.
It always wins. If I drop you in the desert with no water and no compass, you'll probably die,
Yeah,
and a species becomes extinct when it fails to adapt to the environment.
right.
And I'm guessing adaptability, that ability to be agile, to respond to the unexpected is a key facet of what you're trying to achieve
Yeah,
in the preparation and the training of a team of Navy SEALs, or Navy SEALs in general,
yeah.
because you can't predict the battlefield environment in its entirety, including what the opposition are going to do.
No, you're
So,
absolutely right. In fact, environment was our main contender, because even the enemy would elicit or provide an environment. But when you are in environments, whether you're coming into you're making your way into a target or extracting or whatever. But just from a Navy SEAL case, I mean, a lot of our work was in the ocean, right? And
mm,
the ocean is a very interesting, lovely, beautiful, and dangerous thing. And even the best surfers in the world will tell you if you turn your back on the ocean, it will kill you, And as the same goes for if you're jumping out of an airplane at 22,000 feet, with oxygen, or climbing a mountain, or in the desert, or in an area where you're in a gunfight. The environment matters, and when you're one of your primary jobs is to manage, not even manage, is to, because you can't manage an environment, or you can't affect the external piece of it, but to be able to manage yourselves as a team inside of an environment using adaptability and things like that. It becomes a whole different ball game, and you're forced. I think it was a gift for us that we're forced to lean on each other and adapt and overcome and flex and mold and shape, because the external is so unpredictable and uncertain. And this is the
mm,
exact way that we march and effectively move through uncertainty.
mm.
Is this model? It's the best, and really in many cases the only way to do it, depending on the levels of uncertainty.
So, you were the senior officer on every mission that you went on
Mhm.
overseas, and with that seniority of leadership comes enormous responsibility. Um, I think we discussed before when we were having a chat about leadership and stewardship, and I'd had a conversation with somebody else that said that um, the purpose kept coming at them, and they kept pushing it away
Mhm.
because it wasn't what they wanted to do right now. But eventually, everyone else said, "It's you. You need to step up." And you know, I started forming this view that maybe leaders go after the mission, but stewards have the mission come to them, and they know that they are the ones. And then recently, I was talking to another guest, and she made a really interesting comment, and she said, the vision is a gift, which is actually not how a lot of corporate leaders view it. We've all sat around those vision and mission workshops. Let's try and find the words to put on the wall, because
Yeah.
we have to have a purpose or a vision. But I'm getting an emerging feeling that people cast in leadership roles, good people cast in leadership roles, actually have, the mission or the vision come to them, the purpose come to them. And then the question is, do you accept it?
Yeah.
And do you see it as a gift, so that you can go and execute against it? Now, we're heading into rough territory, because not everybody might necessarily agree with this. But when we talk about a military deployment, you're on a mission, and that mission probably has some combat elements to it. There is going to be conflict, armed conflict. But I suspect, as the leader of a group of people going into, say, a battlefield, or at least the threat of conflict, you'd have to be really clear about why are you there doing that. And I suspect it's not always what the political leaders have sent you there to do,
Right.
or the political argument, or whatever the public argument is. How do you think about, I'm taking this group of um, SEALs into this theater of conflict. We better know what the mission is, or find our mission. Just like, can you talk me through that process as the senior leader in those environments?
Yeah, yeah, I sure can. And I would say again, I think I was given a gift, certainly an advantage that I did not ever in my profession have to worry about motivating people. I was surrounded by a group of very highly high performing, motivated people. However, it was still important to understand the mission. And in these cases, the mission of a nation is big and it's complex, and it usually tends to break down into smaller things. And so in our case, the mission was broken down into smaller facets, whether it was, hey, this is a specific bad guy that we need to find. And our mission was always to capture. It was never really to kill. Capture provides intelligence that allows you to capture other bad guys and take
Yeah.
people off the battlefield in an effective way. So, but if you're looking for a bad guy, the process to go find those folks is quite difficult. It's quite complex, and the worst of them were never easy to find, which meant you had to find people who knew where that person was. And so you're deconstructing this matrix of I guess intelligence and finding your way to the overall mission, but you're chunking it down into smaller missions. And so I think in that case, the mission was always quite defined. Hey, we need to go capture this bad guy. But the addition to that was we need to do it in a way that hopefully allows us to capture, not kill, right? But also hopefully keeps us all. We need to do our best to keep us safe or alive. However, we understood that was secondary to the mission, and that's obviously, unique to that profession. It's only the case with certain professions that happens. However, that was always quite clear. But the performance and everybody's individual effort towards that mission was always focused on what can I do to contribute to this team in the most effective way, because this thing's not going to happen by ourselves. No one person. It's not like a Schwarzenegger movie or a Stallone movie, right? No one person is going to do that, right? It's always going to be a team. And so we all know very viscerally that to accomplish the mission, we must work as a team. And so our mission becomes teamwork. Our mission becomes dynamic subordination. Our mission becomes how well can we effectively lean on and use and support each other in the conduct of this thing. And this is why you hear things like, the soldier doesn't really fight for the big mission or even the flag or the nation. The soldier fights for the person standing next to them. Because at the end of the day, that's what's accomplishing the mission, is fighting for the person standing next to you. Because that's the overarching most important thing. Because only then can you actually accomplish the mission.
That's super interesting. You're talking about highly motivated people, and you said that as a gift, you're always working with highly motivated people, but highly motivated people tend to want to know what the reason for this is.
Yeah.
More than less motivated people. And so even within a team of highly motivated people, they don't necessarily need to have a direct line of sight to the national objective or agenda. Proximity is a fascinating thing.
Yes.
Teamwork is built within proximity.
Yeah.
Which is why there are some issues with, work from home, distributed work teams and everything else. But the world is different, and we also need to figure out how to maintain proximity when people could be thousands of miles or kilometers apart.
Yeah.
Sporting teams work really well because of proximity.
Yes.
They're around each other on the sporting field.
Well,
And
and
so,
I would also add a very consistent and visible mission and
yeah,
objective, and actually quite simple to win, right?
yeah,
So the simplicity of that and the proximity of that allows it to be very straightforward.
yeah,
But when the objective is not as simple as that, and proximity is not necessarily as available, right?
yeah,
In other words, I don't have a 50 by 100-yard field inside of
yeah,
which everything's going to happen. It becomes more complex.
absolutely. And so, if we make the bridge from this into the corporate world, right, and into business, there is this belief that everyone in the company needs to understand the vision of the company and the mission of the company. And maybe this challenges that a little bit, do they? Or do they need to know specifically what their team is there to do?
Yeah, yeah,
And how to be a part of that team and make a real difference to whoever the beneficiaries are and the people of that job you're there to do, and the
yeah,
people around you. So, for example, if you work in a payroll team in a very large company, perhaps your purpose is to make sure the money's in the bank account every week when people go to the supermarket to buy their
right,
goods.
right, right.
And that mission is noble.
Yes.
every contribution is noble.
Yeah.
And I think we have become so almost obsessed with, find your why and the big vision that we've lost these. And the
Yeah,
find your why was always about the individual needs to be able to find their why, right? But
well, you
it's
have an
been built.
organization. I would say that organizations do have a why, and organizations do have a vision. And I think
Sure.
that even no matter where you sit in an organization, an awareness and a connection to that larger vision is necessary. In other words, you don't want to be working for an organization whose main goal is, say, against your values, right? That's not
Yes,
going
of
to work,
course.
right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be, and it's not going to be what drives you every day. Right? What
Mm.
drives you every day should be those smaller things, the support of those folks who are actually doing things or even doing them. And we used to have a saying in this. One of my favorite CEOs used to say that that your importance to the objective had nothing to do with your proximity to the X meaning the actual the location of the target. And what he meant by that is obviously as Navy SEALs, we would go onto the X. I mean, our job was to go onto the X and prosecute that target, right? But to get there required a whole set of support, whether it was intelligence or logistics or the helicopter guys who got there or whatever. And so that's intelligence person who's diving into those intelligence reports and reading everything to make sure that he or she gets the information, the pertinent information to us so that we're empowered to know or get us to the right. That person's just as important as the SEAL kicking the door on the target. And so I think that's even in organizations, we can say if payroll doesn't work,
Right.
the team begins to break down, and that's why people matter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I often use payroll as an example when we're talking about the importance of roles inside a company. Payroll represents the primary agreement between the employee and the company. I
Yes.
will give you a certain
Yeah.
number of hours per week, and you'll give me a certain amount of money. Now, if that gets broken consistently through system error or poor performance, people start to wonder, what else can't I trust?
Yes.
It is
Right.
actually the first marker of trust. I'm
Yeah.
I'm going to show up and give you my hours. You need to give me my pay, right?
Yeah.
Without error.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
and
let's back that up a little bit because and Barry Wimler and Bob Chapman were really brilliant at this because they said, because their whole philosophy, of course, is the people are the most important asset. And they
yeah,
said you don't detach that from business success, right? Because you need to have a successful, profitable business so you can actually pay your people so they can maintain a quality of life for their families and loved ones that they actually enjoy, right? So
yeah,
so the payroll represents an agreement between an organization or business and a person that I am here as an organization to help you maintain and provide a quality of life for those that you love and care for, right? That's a
mm,
huge responsibility.
yeah,
And I think organizations need to understand that a little bit more viscerally sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. Even at team level, if the team can't connect to the values and vision of the organization first, but that really highlights the need for great recruitment.
Yes.
If you great hiring, I mean, if you hire someone who's incongruent with the values from the outset, they're unlikely to change their
Yeah.
values.
Yeah.
And they form them over a lifetime. You don't have enough time to get them to align with the corporate values. And the question is, do you have the right to expect that anyway?
Yes.
That someone
Right.
would compromise their personal values. That notion of people need to be able to align with the vision and values of the organization is you deal with that on the inbound. You deal with that by who you choose, right?
Yes.
Um, but what would three kind of higher level but important takeaways you find yourself sharing with corporate leaders over and over again that actually have their roots in the 20 plus years you had in the military, but you hear yourself saying it over and over again because we're still not getting it. Say
Yeah.
three
Yeah.
big takeaways that you find yourself often repeating.
Yeah, I would say certainly one is dynamically subordinate. That's the way we do it. The other would be that the high performing team, the definition of one. It's not just a team that does well. It's a team that performs not only when things are great, but also when things aren't. And the last one is one I haven't mentioned. I'll just give a quick story to emphasize it. And that's a guy. There was a guy named Russell Akoff. He was a systems theorist, behavioral analyst, management science expert. He died in the early 2000s. But he was brilliant at talking about leadership as it related to systems theory. He used to give an example to groups that he spoke to. He used to say, "Hey, if I took every best part of every best vehicle out there, right? So just assume and again, people can disagree with me, just examples here, but maybe the Porsche has the best engine, the Ferrari has the best fuel injection, the Volvo has the best suspension. Take all the best parts of every best vehicle, put them all together in the center of the room. Would I have the best vehicle on the planet? And the answer is no, because you wouldn't have a vehicle, because the parts wouldn't fit together. And he used to say
Yeah.
a system is never the sum of its parts. It's a product of their interaction. And the team is the same way. A team is never the sum of its parts. It's a product of how they interact. And if you focus on just getting the best parts or the best people at the best things,
Interesting.
put them all together, you're likely going to have a toxic team because you're not focusing on what matters, and that's the interactions.
And I guess the reverse is also true. We see this in the sporting arena, particularly. Um, you can take the highest performing individual in a high performing team, and another sporting club steals them with a big paycheck, and they come to. This is personal for me, for this football team I support in Australia, and they might have been the captain of your team.
Yeah,
Let's leave that alone. And another club steals them for a big paycheck, and they go to the other club, but they're never the same player
they're not the same player. Yeah,
because the other players around them were not the ones that were running interference for them
that's
in
right.
the old
That's
club.
right. Yeah,
We're not the people that are sacrificing their game stats to block for them,
right.
and give them that extra half a second of space. And, you take a high performing person, put them in a team that isn't built around a high performing view of the environment. And you just, because it's never one person, as you
Yeah.
said. So, if we get back to this idea of having the right people to start with is critical. And then being able to work with people and help them prepare and be ready and fit and able to then deal with the environment.
Hmm.
You can really only say the environment is our main focus when you've already dealt with the performance of the people
Right.
and you're prepared for that and you can trust that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you can only put a focus on one thing when you trust something else, right?
Right. Right.
And so that's everything. That's recruitment. You're involved in selection processes
Mhm.
for the SEALs. You're involved in training for the SEALs. And so, we all know the stories about special forces, both here and in Australia. It's just a brutal process to get into, and most don't make it. So selection is critical. And then, and so you've been talking about attributes,
Hmm.
which I suspect it's an interesting term. What do you mean about when we say the word attributes? Just walk us through either a definition of that or what that actually means in the way that you use it, and then let's talk about some.
Yeah, the attributes are what tell us if a human being has what it takes to do the job. Not knows how to do the job, but what it takes to do the job. So there's a distinct difference between skills and attributes. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of teaming and building teams. If you build a team based solely on skills, then the best this, best that, you're likely going to have a team that turns toxic because you're not focusing on the interaction. Those interactions are based on qualities that we bring to the equation, bring to the environment. The other thing that attributes allows us for us to do is see and understand how and why we perform the way we do in uncertainty, challenge, and stress when things aren't going the way we planned. And so, quick distinction between the two: skills are not skills are learned; they're not inherent to our nature. None of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball, okay, or drive a car. Skills, we're trained to do those things. We're taught to do those things. Skills direct our behavior and known in specific circumstances. Here's how and when to throw a ball or drive a car. And then finally, skills are very visible. They're very easy to see, which means they're very easy to measure, test, and assess. You can put scores around skills or statistics around skills. You could put skills on resumes, which is why we get seduced by skills often
Mm.
when we're hiring or trying to pick for teams. The problem with skills is they don't tell us how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. This is when we lean on attributes. Attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. In other words, all of us are born with levels of patience or adaptability or situational awareness, right? Now, you can certainly develop these things over time and experience, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. Any of us who have kids or have experienced kids will agree with me when I say there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient, right? So there's a nature nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't direct our behavior. Attributes inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up in an environment. So my son's levels of resilience and perseverance informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're very difficult to measure and test and assess. How do you measure someone's levels of adaptability or patience, right? But The idea is these attributes, if we're ignoring, if we're not paying attention to attributes in our performance picture, we're missing a huge part, if not the most important part of high performing teams. And what I had to do in the SEALs was understand and try to articulate what were those things we were looking for that had nothing to do with scuba diving, shooting, or skydiving, right? And I'll give
Yeah.
you a real quick example that which will drive this home. And you and I may have talked about this in one of our previous conversations, but there's a story that goes back before even I was a SEAL, that a kid showed up to Navy SEAL training, and he went to the instructors and says, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor says, okay, you have to do a swim test. And the kid says, okay, fine. So they take him out to the pool. It's a pretty easy test. It's 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. Kid gets all ready to go. He jumps in the pool. He immediately sinks to the bottom of the pool. And as soon as he's at the bottom of the pool, he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end, and then he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. He comes up, he's gasping for air, nearly drowning. The instructor looks at him and says, what the heck are you doing? And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. At that point, the instructor pauses and looks at the kid and says, that's okay, we can teach you how to swim. And so the idea is, the question is, why did the instructor say that? The instructor said that because he knew if this kid had the attributes to show up to Navy SEAL training, not knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be the easy part, right? And so this is what attributes are. And in doing this, I kind of recognized them, used them in the training, but then also wrote the book about them. And that's the work we do now. We help people and organizations understand what, in fact, the attributes they are looking for are, and help them assess and select for those.
Well, and you have an assessment. You have
Yeah.
an attribute assessment tool, which we are, it's interesting, isn't it? We've got personality assessments, which, and the validity is questionable in terms of the source or how they came about. And, we have behavioral assessments, and, in the recruitment process, companies look at skill sets all the time, the essential criteria and then the preferred criteria.
Right.
And actually none of the attributes that you're talking about are usually listed anywhere there. I mean, how come no job application has said we want someone who has patience,
Right. Yeah.
but we also want someone who has agility of thought, or we want someone, and I'm making up my own version of attributes here. I'm going to ask you for some key ones in a minute. We
Well,
want
I think
someone
the
with
reason
drive, for example.
is because, just real quick, the reason is because it's very difficult to articulate, and that's the mission I kind of gave
Yeah.
myself, is can I articulate this stuff in a way that allows people a language of performance that they otherwise didn't have. And it's been very
Yeah.
helpful in that vein, because now people can say, oh, wait a second, now I know I'm looking for someone with patience or adaptability or whatever. And then you have to go about doing specific things to try to tease that out.
So is there a set of attributes? I mean, were you able to, whittle this down to, there's kind of a core set of attributes that really do tend to point towards high performance in an individual, including the threads of interaction in a team, or is it an endless list, and it's more broadly what's the underlying foundation attributes,
It's a great,
some additional and some examples maybe.
Yeah, great question. Well, so there's a list of attributes, at least that we are working with up to this point. And there are 41 of them. Okay, I certainly concede that there may be more. I'm always looking to add to the list, but right now there are 41 attributes. The idea is that all of us have all of the attributes. Okay, the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each, right? So take adaptability, for example. If 7 is high and 1 is low, kind of based on our Likert scale, I'd be a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Someone else might be a level 3, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow and roll with it, right? They're still adaptable because all human beings are, but they're at different levels. So if we were kind of line up these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own individual unique performance. And there's no judgment there. I always say human beings are like automobiles, okay? But some of us are Jeeps, and some of us are Ferraris, and some of us are SUVs. And there's no judgment, because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But we need to lift our hood and figure out why and how we're playing the way we are. So attributes start to speak to our own individual performance. And when we talk about lists of attributes for high performers, it's always different because it's always dependent on the team. The list of attributes required to be a great Navy SEAL looks different than the list of attributes required to be a great surgeon or teacher or salesperson. So it's really about understanding what niche you're in and what is the unique set of attributes required to be successful in that niche. Because some some environments require Jeeps, some environments require Ferraris, and so you need to the project is to figure out where you stand and do your unique attribute sets fit within the niche you're in. Because if you feel friction, challenge, and upset in what you're doing, it's likely there's a discrepancy in your attribute fit, right? And that's for real. And to know that is very empowering.
And so, if a leader has a person where there is friction and challenge in terms of fit, can the attributes be molded and quickly enough, or is it fundamentally an issue of fit, and that person needs to be in a different role that is more suited to the attributes?
So a couple ways to answer that. First of all, attributes can be developed. So in other words, if you're low on an attribute, you can develop it. The thing is, you can't develop it the same way you can a skill, okay? Because you can't teach, and here's actually a quick way for people to understand or determine whether or not they're dealing with a skill or an attribute. It's ask a very simple question. Can I teach it, or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute, right? So if you said, Rich, I want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye, I could take you to the range and teach you how to do that within a couple hours. That's a skill. Or you said, Rich, I want to learn how to be more patient. I can't teach you how to do that, right? And so attributes can, if you're low on an attribute, you can definitely develop it. However, there's 3 criteria, okay, that have to be met. First is you have to know you're low on it, okay?
Yeah.
Second is you have to have a reason or motivation or desire to develop it. What do I mean by that? It's because just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you have to develop it. In other words, being low on that might be exactly what you need for your specific niche. I always kind of say the stand-up comic with too much empathy is going to be a lousy stand-up comic. Okay. So you have to understand that developing this will in fact help you in your niche. So assuming number 1, yes, I know I'm low. Number 2, okay, developing this will in fact help me. Number 3 is the most important part. You have to go find environments inside of which you tease and test that attribute. So if you want to develop your patience, go find environments that test and tease your patience, whatever that looks like for you. It could be, I'm going to deliberately drive in traffic. I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in, or I always say have kids. Having kids will develop patience, right? But whatever that is, you can do that for any attribute. But the key is just because you're low on one doesn't necessarily mean you need to develop it. Now that's part 1. Part 2 is, if you have someone in a role that's underperforming, you may find that person is underperforming because they're deficient in maybe 1 or 2 attributes, and that person may find it to be a valuable project to develop those attributes. That certainly can be done. But you also may find that person's attribute list is just not aligned, right? I had this happen to me. I was in charge of about many people, but I had a department where it was a supply department, and we had 2 sections, right? One section dealt with future acquisition and research. The other one dealt with administrative logging and things like that, log keeping. I had a person in the future acquisition side who was grossly underperforming, and there was morale problems, and it was just bad. I brought this person in, and we had a quick conversation, and I had already done this work, so I knew. So within 10 minutes, I knew immediately that this person's attribute list, their unique set, was completely misaligned for the role they're in. But it was perfectly aligned for this other role, this administrative role. So all I did was move this person over, performance skyrocketed, right? So it's not necessarily about having to develop. It's also not necessarily about having to fire people. You may just have to shift seats on the bus, and you find performance skyrocketing.
And it also is not necessarily about that person has ill intent, that they're just trying to get an easy ride or something. And I suspect attributes, when we talk about the importance of self-awareness, I suspect we're sitting right in the sweet spot of attributes when we talk about self-awareness.
I totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. And I will just let me add this, Simon, because I think this is one of the reasons why I love attributes, and kind of one of my missions is I want to help people understand who they are at their most raw, right? Yeah. When everything's hitting the fan, when the plan is going haywire, when you're steeped in uncertainty, who's the person who shows up? Because I got that gift going through SEAL training, of course, being a SEAL. And I'll tell you, as much as I love most of the personality assessments, I think they're great, and I wouldn't badmouth any of them. When the what hits the fan, personality goes out the window, right? Yeah. I mean, and you are at a raw position, and attributes, that self-awareness allows us to understand exactly who we are and who shows up, and that's really important.
So, last little topic before we wrap up, because this has been fascinating, and so we've gone for a while.
Yeah.
But what do you do when you're dealing with a leader of a team or leaders of a team who don't have attribute self-awareness on themselves.
Yeah.
And so actually they don't know that there's a mismatch of attribute to requirements of the role and the environment they're in, which means I'm assuming if there's no knowledge, there's also at that point automatically not a desire to develop the attribute because there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
knowledge, right?
Yeah.
How do you break that news to someone in the leadership role? The
Yeah.
leadership role, hey, Rich, come and help my team. And you're going, well, it's not really the team that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you?
So there's a couple ways. I mean, obviously, me doing it, I have an in because I was a Navy SEAL and I got some creds that I can throw in
Yeah.
from the side. But let's talk about a realistic situation where someone's in an organization and in charge of a team, and the leader above them is not necessarily living up to what they need to live up. We kind of have a philosophy that's kind of permeated through some elements of the military. Certainly, something my buddy Simon Sinek and I have talked about, and that is we model the behavior we want to see more of, and we reward the behavior we want to see more of. So I always tell people, it's you can always lead up, okay, but the only way you can do that is to make extraordinary efforts, taking care of the span of your care, right? Doing more of what you want to inspire and empower and make your team the best, because what'll happen usually is that will proliferate laterally. People over here will be like, hey, what's going on there? What's going on? It'll proliferate laterally, obviously proliferate down, but then it'll start to proliferate up too. People up here will be like, hey, what's going on there? There's something going on there we need to look into. Okay. And you make note of it, right? Now, it could also be you have a relationship with this person and you could have a candid conversation. Hopefully that's the case because that's the fastest way. But if you don't have that, it's all about taking care of your span of care, modeling the behavior you want to see more of, and rewarding the behavior you want to see more of.
Yeah. So we're back to I think was it Gandhi, be the change that you want to see
Yeah.
in others.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
back to that again.
That's
So
right.
um Rich, I could go backwards and forwards all day with you on
Yeah.
this stuff. It's just fascinating. And I so appreciate you giving us this time. I want to thank you for that. The challenge for leaders, not just in business, but in every arena, is pretty simple. Um, you should be seeking optimal performance in your team and understand what that actually means. Let's be crystal clear about language. Let's not fall into the traps of trend labels and things like that. And in terms of being crystal clear about the language, let's understand that a high-performing team is how it shows up both when things are going great, but also when they're up against the wall.
Yeah.
And we should all be striving to be leaders of those kinds of environments to serve the purpose that we're actually there for, and lean in on attributes. The obsession with skills isn't necessarily getting us to where we need to be. And so as stewards of resources, including human resources, perhaps we need to be better stewards of the concept of attributes
Mhm.
and be stewards of making best and greatest use of the qualities of the people that are in front of you,
Mhm.
with the right fit and then the development of attributes, as opposed to most efficient use of the resource, which would be a skill set conversation. So, I've probably opened up another 45-minute conversation there. I won't do that. We'll stop there, Rich. Thank you so much for the time you've given us today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I've loved the conversation, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.